Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and joining our session, New Federal FAFSA Guidance for Homeless Youth. We'll just wait a few minutes for folks to log in. But in the meantime, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your role, and where you're from. So again, welcome. We'll get started in just a few minutes as folks are coming in. All right, lots of people from all over the place. We love to see it. We have liaisons, we have financial aid administrators. Oh my gosh, so many people. Oh, amazing. Well, again, just welcome. We are so excited to have you. This webinar is being presented in partnership with our friends at Youth Law Center and John Burton Advocates for Youth. And so they'll be helping out with the chat and the Q&A. So I know folks are still coming in, so welcome. Awesome. All right. Before we hear from our superstar presenters, we have some general housekeeping here. So this is a 90-minute webinar that is being recorded. You will receive a copy of this PowerPoint and this recording, a certificate of attendance, and accompanying resources in these next few days. Audio is set to mute all the attendees here, but we welcome all your questions in the Q&A section. So all questions in the Q&A. Our chat is enabled. We're seeing all of these introductions coming in right now. And so we're excited to have some discussion throughout the presentation, but we really want to keep our focus here on our presenters and what they're sharing with us today. Just a quick note from our folks at the Department of Education. Information presented today is on background and not for direct attribution. For comment about any information presented today, you can contact press@ed.gov. So if you are joining a Schoolhouse Connection webinar for the very, very first time, we are excited to have you here. We are a national organization working to overcome homelessness from birth to post-secondary education. We provide practical assistance and strategic advocacy, both on the federal and state level. And we're going to add our website to the chat. So if you want to learn more, you can go ahead and see on our website. Here's a little bit of our agenda today. So I'll start with some level setting on the definition of homelessness, on higher education. Then I'm going to turn it over to our friends at the Department of Education to share some really exciting FAFSA updates. And lastly, we'll have Tori, a financial aid administrator from Westchester University, to provide that financial aid administrator perspective on implementing the provisions. And we'll be sure to have some ample amount of time for Q&A before closing out with our resources. So to get us started, when we are talking about homelessness on the FAFSA, we're talking specifically about unaccompanied homeless youth, or unaccompanied youth who are self-supporting and at risk of homelessness. You can see on the graphic on this slide, the different definitions of each of the terms. And so these students are independent students, meaning that they do not need to include parental information on the FAFSA. However, we know that many students might also be experiencing homelessness, but they're with their families. And so for the sake of the FAFSA, they aren't considered homeless and would just fill out the FAFSA as instructed. I also want to take some time to really clarify what the legal definition of homelessness is when we're talking about the FAFSA. This is pulled from the education subtitle of the McKinney-Vento Act, meaning lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And this can look like a lot of different things. This can include youth staying with others temporarily due to a loss of housing or an economic hardship, as well as those in shelters, unsheltered situations, perhaps staying in a car due to a lack of adequate and alternative accommodations. So despite increased skepticism about the value of higher education, we believe that higher ed is the surest way for students experiencing homelessness. so they can get out of that cycle of homelessness and reach financial independence and stability. A study from Chapin Hall shows that higher education appears to be a protective factor against youth homelessness. College enrollment is nearly 4 times higher for young adults without experience of homelessness. But college costs money, which is where financial aid comes to play. Oh, that is my dog. So new data from Washington links financial aid and upward mobility. Students coming from families with household incomes of less than $63,000 saw an economic status rise within 3 years of earning a degree and entering the labor force. So we know that financial aid makes a difference. High school seniors who complete the FAFSA are 63% more likely to enroll in higher ed. The higher the amount of aid they receive, the higher likelihood that they will successfully transfer or graduate. However, all of this is easier said than done, I understand. And so after many years of advocacy, I'm so excited to share some of the new FAFSA provisions for homeless and foster youth that were passed. So I'm going to turn it over to our presenters now from the Department of Education to talk through the new FAFSA and what it means for our students. So Kerri and Aaron, I'll turn it to you and I will go ahead and mute.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're over on the West Coast and it's still early afternoon before lunch for you. Welcome and thanks for having us today. My name is Kerri Moseley-Hobbs. I am a policy specialist for federal student aid in the U.S. Department of Education. My subject matter expertise in the U.S. Department of Education is the needs analysis formula, which creates the EFC, soon to be SAI, the FAFSA application, student eligibility, incarcerated students, homeless students, foster care students, and the Second Chance Pell Program, which was the catalyst that changed the provision that gave incarcerated students eligibility for the Pell Grant back come July 1, 2023. So I'm just going to go through with you before I pass it on to my colleague, Aaron Washington, who is in our Office of Postsecondary Education. And he'll get a little bit more into the specifics of the provisions that recently passed related to unaccompanied homeless youth determinations. But I'm just going to go through the law that changed everything and some basic ideas of how implementation is going to happen. And then we'll provide you with some additional resources that we've already published on the subject here within federal student aid. So we'll go through the implementation overview. So the two main pieces of legislation that changes what we know as federal student aid right now happens in 2 parts. It actually happens in 3, but the main thing happens in 2 parts. You have the Future Act, which passed in 2020. And the Future Act is what connected us to the IRS in order to get income and tax information directly to the IRS to put into the FAFSA application. That builds what we are calling the FADDX, which is the Financial Aid Data Exchange, that will bring the information from the IRS directly into the FAFSA for U.S. tax return filers. So this is only for U.S. tax return filers, not for foreign tax return filers. It's going to be different from the current IRS DRT. The IRS data retrieval tool that's currently embedded in the FAFSA brings IRS tax information over, but only when that is initiated by the FAFSA applicant. Under the Future Act, we'll be able to get the information directly from the IRS because the applicant will give us consent to get that information. What's very interesting about the Future Act is it made that consent for us to get the information from the IRS a requirement for Title IV eligibility. So every FAFSA filer has to provide consent starting with the 24-25 award year in order to be eligible for federal student aid. Even if there is no tax information on file from the IRS, consent is now a requirement for Title IV eligibility starting for 24-25. The next act that happened was the Consolidated Appropriations Act. The Consolidated Appropriations Act was consolidated appropriations. So appropriations is how the government funds itself. Consolidated is because they wrapped up a whole lot of other smaller or larger bills in with funding itself. So it's a Consolidated Appropriations Act. So what that act did is within it was the FAFSA Simplification Act. And the point of the FAFSA Simplification Act was to do significant changes to the FAFSA application, the needs analysis formula, and it also did changes in some smaller areas that most people don't think about, except for populations like you who are specifically advocates for unaccompanied homeless youth. And so we'll talk about what the FAFSA Simplification Act did in general, and then my colleague Erin will talk about what it did for unaccompanied homeless youth specifically. So the Consolidation Appropriations Act in 2022, again, appropriations is how the government funds itself. Consolidation, it's because it included some other things that had nothing to do with funding. It provided some technical corrections. So when the FAFSA Simplification Act passed, we went through it in detail as we should, and we figured out there were some places where the way it was written, we actually couldn't implement it as smoothly as it needed to be, or there was some conflicting information and we couldn't implement it at all. We did let Congress know, and they did some technical corrections to FAFSA Simplification Act and the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022. So how are we implementing FAFSA simplification? So as you can imagine, with the massive change to almost everything that we know now as Title IV aid and federal student aid, it changed almost everything. So what that did, it not only required us to redevelop the FAFSA form on the front end, but it also required us to rebuild a lot of our systems on the back end in order for the system to even do what the FAFSA Simplification Act required it to do. So what we did is we decided, we went back and we did a implementation timeline so that we would roll out the requirements of FAFSA Simplification Act over several award years. So the rollout actually started in the 2021-2022 school year, where we rolled out the subsidized usage limited applied calculator, which is really for the student loan programs. And then we also rolled out the removal of negative consequences associated with people who were convicted of drug convictions or who failed to register for selective service. And that award year, as you remember, or if you may recall, the questions about selective service and the drug conviction questions were still on the FAFSA. And when the FAFSA was processed, when the colleges got an ISAR, it still had a comment code that required them to resolve the information with the applicant. But here at the U.S. Department of Education, we released some guidance that told them that the FAFSA was going to process as if everything is the same, but in terms of policy, they no longer had to take action and they could ignore those comment codes. In the 22-23 award year, we saw the implementation of the comments for the applicants on the SAR updated to clarify that regardless of the answer to the question for drug conviction selective service, now we were communicating with the student that no further action was required specifically for selective service, because selective service was one of the requirements for Title IV eligibility, but that was no longer the case. In the 23-24 award year coming up, you'll see the removal of the drug conviction question, the selective service questions from the FAFSA. You'll see the addition of a demographic survey. And so in the FAFSA Simplification Act, we're required to ask questions about sex and gender and race and ethnicity. The answer to those questions or those questions have absolutely no bearing on Title IV eligibility. We couldn't embed it within the FAFSA for the 23-24 award year. It would be embedded in the 24-25 award year. So for the 23-24 award year, which is the current award year, it pops up like a survey. We also see the expansion of Pell Lifetime Eligibility used restorations, the extension of Pell eligibility to incarcerated students, the carryover responses for homeless unaccompanied youth. Erin will get into that a little bit more, but one of the provisions within FAFSA Simplification Act is that once a student has an unaccompanied homeless youth determination, that determination can be used across subsequent award years. And so for 23-24, we carried over anyone who had a homeless youth determination flag checked off on the ISAR that is processed at the schools from the 22-23 into the 23-24 award year. But Erin will repeat later on for the 24-25 award year, that flag will not carry over because we're moving to a new system. However, within the schools, they can just reset the flag without going through the process with the homeless youth again, if nothing about the circumstances have changed. but Aaron will get into that a little bit more. The 24-25 forward, the subsequent award years, it will carry forward. Again, it's just not carrying forward from 23-24 to 24-25, just because we're switching over to a new system. We also see the changes of cost of attendance go to effect for 23-24, the expansion of professional judgment for 23-24, and expansion for acceptable documentation for unaccompanied homeless youth goes into effect 23-24 award year also, but my colleague Aaron will get into that. And then 24-25 is really everything else, which is also the major changes to FAFSA Simplification Act. We see the sunset of the EFC and the birth of the SAI. We also see the sunset of the current Pell eligibility calculation and the birth of the new Pell eligibility calculation. And then we'll see potential changes to verification selection. We're actually not anticipating any for 24-25. We're just going to watch and see how things go. And then you'll see the inclusion of the provisional independent student classification for 24-25. So for some operational changes, the revisions to the cost of attendance components and consumer information must be made publicly available. For cost of attendance, we see some small changes. I don't really want to get too much into that because we have a long presentation going on, but we did have at the end of our section of this presentation in our resources, we point through some resources. If you look on Google for the Knowledge Center for Federal Student Aid, a lot of our Dear Colleague letters and electronic announcements are there that really outline these major changes that include unaccompanied homeless youth because they're applicable to all students in general, but we want to focus on the unaccompanied homeless youth, so I don't really want to take up too much time in that area. The only thing I want to point out here on this slide is that in the 23-24 implementation, we see some changes and expansions to professional judgment. And probably the one thing to point out that's most important for you is that unusual circumstances are now dependency overrides, but FAFSA Simplification Act made unaccompanied homeless youth determinations a special category within itself. However, we're not really going to push schools to not use the term professional judgment when they are kind of advertising or talking about the availability of these unaccompanied homeless youth determinations to their students. But for your notice, it really is a special category of itself under FAFSA simplification. Some other 23-24 implementation, the federal program eligibility, the restoration of LEU for borrowers with certain loan discharges and successful borrower defense claims. They're going to add their Pell eligibility used back to that LEU. And so there may be some students who will see their LEU increase from a higher percentage from what it is being presented now. And then of course we have July 1, 2023, people who are incarcerated and enrolled in prison educational programs will be able to get a Pell Grant. And then you have, of course, the FAFSA form changes that I've already been through. You see the collection of race and ethnicity, sex and gender, and you see the removal of selective service and drug conviction questions. The only thing I want to add here in terms of the survey questions on race, ethnicity, and sex and gender is that when applicants and your students complete this survey or choose to answer this question, even if they have the option, choose not to disclose, we will not be sharing that information to schools. We will not be sharing that information with schools for 23-24 or 24-25, and we don't plan on sharing that information with schools right now in the future. So you can let your students know that. Also, we'll see that in 24-25, the 3 existing homeless youth questions will become 1. And we'll talk about that a little later also. The 24-25 implementation. 24-25, the hopes of FAFSA simplification is to reduce the cognitive load and minimize redundant processing. We want to maximize the reuse of previously collected data. So in addition to the homeless youth determinations moving forward across subsequent award years, we were looking if there were other places that we'll be able to do that and improve on that. And then we're also trying to improve the placement. The goal is intuitive, consistent, transparent, and efficient form, and a better experience for all. One of the major changes, the sunset of the EFC and the birth of the Student Aid Index will be used to determine eligibility. Formula for need actually will stay the same, where need will equals the cost of attendance that the school sets minus the Student Aid Index or SAI minus other financial aid will give the student the need. The only thing I want to point out here is if you are a financial aid administrator, you will notice that we're going to start using other financial aid in our information. That section used to be for the need calculation, EFA, estimated financial aid. FAFSA Simplification Act replaced the term EFA or estimated financial aid and started using the term other financial aid. So we had to follow suit. We are aware that there are some schools who will call their institutional-based financial aid or their college-based financial aid other financial aid, and we're kind of hijacking the term, and we didn't mean to, but that's how they did it in the FAFSA Simplification Act. So our apologies in advance, but that's where you'll start seeing that language going forward. The Student Aid Index will be based on income on the FAFSA, which will come directly from the data exchange in the IRS. That is why consent is required. The Student Aid Index can be a negative number as low as negative 1,500. And those who are not required to file a tax return in the base year will get an automatic negative 1,500. So the automatic zero EFC goes away, but you have this automatic negative 1,500. Keep in mind, though, we hope to be releasing some guidance in the near future that for federal student aid purposes, for packaging, a negative 1,500 SAI should be treated as a zero, not a negative 1,500. So we're not really planning to inflate the need in terms for federal student aid. For Pell eligibility, so Pell eligibility used to be connected strictly to the EFC. If you had EFC that was lower than the maximum Pell eligibility for that award year, you would get a Pell as long as it was within the minimum compared to your cost of attendance, compared to your number of credits you were enrolled. The number of credits you were enrolled was full-time, 3/4 time, half-time, less than half-time. In the new environment for 24-25, Pell eligibility is its own calculation now. It may use the SAI, it may not, but it is its own calculation now. So who gets a maximum Pell grant? Non-tax filers, they'll get a negative 1,500 SEI and a maximum Pell grant. They don't get a maximum Pell grant because of a negative 1,500 SAI. They get a maximum Pell grant because they were non-tax filers and they're assigned a negative 1,500 SAI. Single parent filers who make less, whose AGI is less than zero, whose AGI is 0 or less than 225% of the poverty line. And if you know, the poverty level guidelines are published by the federal government every year, and we'll be using the published poverty level guidelines to figure out if the AGI that was reported on the tax return is less than or equal to 225% of that poverty line. And we'll be using 2 poverty line charts because, you know, you have one, I think it's like 48 states, and then you have one that's like Hawaii and all. So you will be using those 2 different charts. For US territories, will we be using the 48 states, I believe. For non-single students or parents with a AGI that is 0 more, but equal to or less than 175% of the poverty line will get a maximum Pell Grant eligibility. And for applicants that are ineligible for a maximum Pell, they may get what we call a calculated Pell, which will be the maximum Pell Grant eligibility for that award year minus a calculated SAI will give you what we call a calculated Pell for people who are not eligible for a maximum Pell and not eligible for a minimum Pell. And a minimum Pell is also its own calculation. However, a minimum Pell is still, as it has been, at minimum Pell is 10% of the maximum Pell. So for example, if the maximum Pell is $1,000, the minimum Pell is $100, okay? So for the Pell calculation, we went over this a little bit, but I just wanted to put it on the screen in case you are a visual learner instead of an audio learner. This is exactly what I just went through. So step one, when determining Pell eligibility, we're going to determine if the applicant is eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, and it's going to be based on the tax filing status, whether they're a tax filer or non-tax filer, their AGI, the published poverty level guidelines, and their family size. And the family size is going to come from the tax return. It's going to come from the number of people reported or claimed on the tax return. Keep in mind, right now, the tax return no longer has an exemption field. So it's literally going to count the number of people that are reported and claimed on the tax return. Step two, if you're not eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, we are going to do a calculated Pell. And to do a calculated Pell, we're going to calculate the SAI, and then we're going to take the maximum Pell minus the calculated SAI, adjusted for enrollment to determine the Pell eligibility. And then if you are not eligible for a maximum Pell or a calculated Pell, we do look at you for a minimum Pell, and a minimum Pell is calculated also based on poverty level guidelines, being a certain percentage, whether you are a single parent or not a single parent. For more information and details on these steps, there is a draft 24-25 Pell Grant Eligibility and Student Aid Index Technical Assistance Manual. Again, if you go to our resources for the Knowledge Center for Federal Student Aid, it'll be a resource for everyone to look at. You'll be able to get more information about that there. Okay, Pell Grant eligibility still cannot exceed cost of attendance, and less than full-time enrollment actually may be able to get a Pell Grant. It's reduced, but they may actually be able to get a Pell Grant now, because Pell Grant is going to be based on a formula. So the Pell Grant disbursement, the Pell Grant schedule and disbursement table that everyone is used to, where we have the cost of attendance here, and then the EFC here, and then all of the various Pell eligibility throughout the chart goes away. So it sunsets with the EFC, and what it will be replaced with is a formula that will take into account the scheduled Pell award that is calculated based on those steps 1, 2, and 3, and then looks at enrollment intensity, because enrollment intensity now under FAFSA Simplification Act is proportional, which means you can have Pell anywhere between 1% and 100%. And so that's why it's a formula now. So that says, that was the summary of FAFSA Simplification Act. I try to summarize it as best that I can, but it was a major, major act, everyone. And literally within Department of Education, FAFSA Simplification Act can be a presentation all in itself that can last an hour, and then a half hour of Q&A. And we just tried to wrap it up really quickly. So I pass it on to my colleague, Erin Washington from the Office of Postsecondary Education, who will outline the changes and the provisions for unaccompanied homeless youth determinations. Erin?
Thank you very much, Kira. So for this, we just have some introductory slides. What I really kind of want to get into is the actual contents of the Dear Colleague letter that we released for the changes made by the FAFSA Simplification Act. That Dear Colleague letter is not on your screens. So the next few slides, so I'm Jillian, you don't have to click through the next few slides. What I just wanted to do is go over it, with the remaining time that we have. It should only take me about 10 minutes to get through it. So essentially, Jillian indicated earlier in the beginning of her presentation that for the purposes of student eligibility, if a student is unaccompanied and homeless, or they're unaccompanied and self-supporting and at risk of homelessness, then they'd be considered independent for federal student aid purposes. And for student eligibility, that's really the difference between including parental income on the parental information on the FAFSA and not. And that's really how we think about it in terms of Title IV federal student aid. We have definitions of unaccompanied homeless. We have some definitions in the Dear Colleague letter, like unaccompanied, and homeless, which are also definitions in the McKinney-Vento Act. But then we also have some definitions that aren't in there. So we have a definition of at risk of being homeless and also a definition of self-supporting, just to hopefully help financial aid offices understand what students would actually qualify to apply for aid as an independent student. Of course, qualifying for aid as an independent student may yield that the student would be eligible for a Pell Grant or more subsidized direct loans. So regardless of the age of the student, regardless of the age of the applicant, they can be considered unaccompanied and homeless or at risk of being homeless. The idea there is that because the term in the statute is unaccompanied homeless youth, we know that there's a lot of different definitions for what individuals could consider youth or not. And for our purposes, generally anybody under the age of 24 on the FAFSA is a dependent student if they don't meet a different independent category, like if they're like a veteran of the armed services, or they were in foster care beyond the age of 13, or maybe they're an emancipated minor. So otherwise you'd be considered dependent. But just because there's that term youth does not mean that you have to qualify that with age. So anybody could be considered homeless. So our policy guidance goes a little further to state that, beginning with the 24-25 application, there'll be one question on the FAFSA, which Kerri discussed earlier. So if a student answers yes to that question, then they'll also be asked, do they have documentation from one of the legally authorized entities that is able to determine if a student is unaccompanied and homeless or at risk of being unaccompanied and homeless. I'll talk about those legally authorized entities just in a moment. But if the student can answer yes to that one question on the FAFSA, then they will be able to continue to complete the FAFSA as an independent student. So when a student is first applying, Kerri talked about how the determination will be carried forward into subsequent years. But when a student is first applying for federal student aid on the FAFSA, they may be asked by their institution to submit documentation. So, like, let's say I answer yes on the FAFSA to the homelessness question. My school may actually reach out to me and ask me for documentation. There's no requirement from the Department of Education to do that. That's nothing new. That's how it's always been. There's currently 3 questions in the FAFSA about homelessness, but we are aware that many schools choose to verify that, and that is within their authority to verify any question on the FAFSA in which they want to, not just the homeless questions, but any question on the FAFSA a school can choose to verify. It's just not a federal verification requirement. So, as Kerri talked about, so for the 23-24 FAFSA, a student will still has the opportunity to have that homelessness status carried forward, but they'll have to manually adjust it until the 24-25 FAFSA, and then that's when it will be an automatic carry forward. But on the 25-26 FAFSA, they'll still see the question, it'll just be pre-populated. So they'll have the opportunity to review the question, and they'll also have the opportunity to make a change if their unaccompanied homeless youth status or risk status has changed. So unaccompanied homeless youth should mail you have to enter an address on the FAFSA. So you should you should include on the address on the FAFSA where you can reasonably receive mail. That could be a friend, a social service agency, or the school itself. And the school should update the FAFSA if there is more stable housing that could potentially be secure. The student should update the FAFSA if there's more stable housing that has been secured. So I talked about those legally authorized entities that are able to make that, well, I alluded to that are able to make the homeless youth determination. And those are the local education agency homeless liaison as designated by the McKinney-Vento Act, or their designee, or the designee liaison, the director or designee of an emergency transitional shelter, street outreach program, homeless youth drop-in center, or other programs serving individuals who are experiencing homelessness. That's a new one that was not in the Higher Education Act prior. So all these are in the Higher Education Act as well. Like Higher Education Act authorizes the federal student aid programs. Another one is a designee, a director or designee of a program funded under subtitle B of the McKinney-Vento, of Title IV of McKinney-Vento. the director or designee of the federal TRIO program or gaining early awareness and readiness for undergraduate program, Gear Up. So that again, that's a new addition to the Higher Education Act for somebody that can declare somebody to be unaccompanied and homeless. And also a financial aid administrator can do that. Just keep in mind that I said over and over again, it's either the actual director or a designee. So it could be somebody, so the shelter or the drop-in center could designate somebody who's not the director to make these determinations as well. So if a student indicates that they're unaccompanied or homeless on the FAFSA, and the institution chooses to verify that student, if the student is, let's say the student's unable to provide the actual physical documentation, or then the financial aid administrator has to review the students has to make the determinations. They have to review the student's circumstances to make that determination. Let's say the student alternatively is unable to answer yes on the FAFSA to those questions. The financial aid administrator still has to review the student's circumstances to make the determination. And let's say let's say the financial aid administrator doesn't really know how to make that determination. They can reach out to one of those legally authorized entities or really any stakeholder in the community for help with making that determination. And make sure you're not divulging the student's personally identifiable information when you're doing that. Another good resource is nche.ed.gov for some really great resources there. You can also email me or Kira if you have any questions as well. We can hopefully provide you with some more resources. So in both situations, if the school is choosing to verify the student's answer on the FAFSA, or the student can't answer yes, then the school can make that, the financial aid administrator has to make the determination, and that can be through a written statement. That can be with documented interview with the students. So it doesn't necessarily have to be some official form that you get from one of the legally authorized entities, because the student is saying they can't get that. And so what the law did and what the Department of Education has historically done is try to provide the utmost flexibility to making these homeless youth determinations to the financial aid administrator, because the financial aid administrator is working directly with the student. They know this, they're hopefully, know the students pretty well. And so they have flexibility in the type of documentation that they get in making those homeless youth determinations. They do have to have it, documented in the student's file how they made it, but we don't prescribe too in depth on it has to be on letterhead, or it has to be this, or it has to be that. So the most important thing that has come up since I've been working on homeless youth, on issues related to homeless youth, is that you hear sometimes, not all the time, because but you do hear sometimes that a financial aid administrator wants to go an extra step to find out why the student is homeless, and they want that to weigh into their decision on whether they will determine the student to be homeless or not. And that is not what the department instructs financial aid officers to do. The question is the student homeless? And if the student is determined to be homeless based on those definitions or at risk of homelessness, then the student is eligible to apply for aid as an independent student, full stop. The financial aid officers should not be going further. And I'm not saying that financial aid officers do this. Financial aid officers, we have really great relations with them. And they are more than capable of, adequately performing their duties, but we do not want financial aid officers to ask why the student is homeless. We just want them to understand or ascertain if the student is homeless. So for instance, if the student had to flee an abusive home environment, the student lacks that adequate, housing, then that's it. It doesn't, even if this parent is saying they can come stay with me, that's inconsequential to the homeless youth determination. Only a little bit more, and then I'll be turning it over. So the homeless youth determination has to be made on what we call the FAFSA base year. And so that's what we mean by that is that's a year before the student is actually going to receive federal student aid. So let's say the student is applying for federal student aid for the 24-25 award year, then the student would have to be homeless on or after July 1st, 2023. So basically it's a year before the student is going to receive their federal student aid. Starting with the 23-24 award year, the determination has to be made as quickly as possible, but no later than 60 days after the student enrolls. But it could be before, it could be as early as the year before the applicable award year. let's see, there's a little bit, so there's a lot more guidance in the Federal Student Aid Handbook, the application and verification guide. It's kind of like the lead in to the Federal Student Aid Handbook. It's before volume 1. And then there's some document maintenance issues, document maintenance in relation to homeless youth, but I don't want to go too deep into that. So Jillian, would you mind going all the way down to the I think there's a resource slide. Thank you for trying to keep up with where I was going. I just wanted to go through the Dear Colleague letter as opposed to like go through the slides, like, because I feel like that I just wanted to fill in a little more information, but I appreciate you doing that. There's some references here for you all. That's just the actual Higher Education Act, FAFSA Simplification Act, and the Application Verification Guide, and then also the 2015 is the FAFSA. That one is just Dear Colleague letter. 2215 is just the Dear Colleague letter describing all the changes that Kerri talked about. So I will turn it over to Tori for more.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tori Nuccio. I work at Westchester University, and you're probably wondering why me when you have the fantastic Department of Education and FSA here with you. So I'm going to try to talk to you guys a little bit more about what this looks like on the ground level for my colleagues in financial aid and for the advocates on the call who work with these students, both how it's been looking pre-FAFSA simplification and how we're hoping it's going to improve as we update some of our policies and procedures. I will try to be brief though, as I know that I am the barrier between your questions and Aaron and Kerri's answers, but hopefully I can provide some insight. So I have been wearing 2 hats for a while. I've been at Westchester University for 11 years. And for those of you who don't know Westchester University, it's about 45 minutes outside of Philadelphia. It's part of the Pennsylvania state system of higher education. So we're a 4-year public institution, and we have about 17,000 students, undergrad and grad combined. And I was originally hired as assistant director to work with Pell and verification, but quickly started learning more and wanting to better serve our unaccompanied homeless youth population. And my prior institution, I did not learn enough information to separate in my mind dependency overrides and homeless youth determinations. And once I realized that there was a clearer path for this population that was significantly at risk, not just in accessing financial aid, but accessing higher education, I wanted to make sure that I better understood that process. So I have collaborated with SchoolHouse Connections in the past. I have also worked with the Field Center at University of Pennsylvania on a foster care to college initiative. And I've also worked on the higher ed committee for NACE, which is the National Association of Educating Homeless Children and Youth. So I have given these presentations before, but I am also very excited that Kerri and Aaron are here to add some backbone to what I am demonstrating. So what is Westchester doing now? So right now, not many students answer the questions correctly on the FAFSA. I think they're unfortunately a little intimidating because even when they do have proper documentation, they don't understand, if that person was a school district liaison, even though they work at their school, or if the shelter they stayed at was funded by HUD or RHYA. So I just think the language around those questions, unfortunately, does throw students off, even when it is very easy to collect that confirmation and confirm. So I have had times where students, ask for assistance, but then all of a sudden I get a letter from a school district liaison and it's actually a pretty straightforward case. And those are great. It's nice to just, check off a box and move forward. But I would say the majority of them are not that straightforward. I actually have learned a lot of these students have had cases in high school where they just didn't know where to turn or didn't know anybody would do anything about it. So they didn't share that level of information in high school. However, now that it's impacting access to aid, they want to share it now. We've had students where we just found them from rejected FAFSA forms. So for those not in the financial aid community, the ICER is a FAFSA. It's what we receive at the college level to process the FAFSA form. So those students, we would reach out and say, your FAFSA is rejected. Can we help you complete your FAFSA? And some of them would write back and say, well, I don't have a parent to sign the FAFSA and I don't have a parent to fill out this section. And that kind of opened up the conversation of, which pathway are we going on, dependency override or homeless youth determination. And honestly, we like to schedule appointments for those types of conversations and unusual circumstances because asking for them to write a statement is not as easy as it sounds. And I will say this is very case by case. Some students will give me a full, story of what's going on in the case of, I am without housing, and other students will write I don't have a parent. And that's all they write in the email. And I know you guys have gotten those types of emails as well. So sitting down with them and kind of talking through, why don't you have somebody to put on the FAFSA form kind of helps us answer some of the questions that Erin was just laying out in the checklist of, do you qualify for a homeless youth determination, or are we going to go in a different direction? Because homelessness isn't really part of what we're talking about. You do feel stable. You are in a structure you've been in for 20 years. It just happens to not be with parents. So I do see some of the questions in the Q&A already touching on that. It's really hard to separate the two. So I do touch on that in a future slide. So we meet with our students every year right now to refile the FAFSA that we made determinations for, because unfortunately that status is not rolling over right now. So we send it out, it rejects, it comes back, we send it out with our determination. So it'll come back ideally with an official EFC, and then we can process financial aid. So it's a little bit of ping-ponging right now, and simultaneously we have to do a separate process at the state level. So even after you're finished this full presentation, I would recommend pivoting your questions and conversation to how this impacts state aid, because for us in Pennsylvania, unaccompanied homeless youth determination is not an automatic independent status for considering Pennsylvania aid. So it is a separate process and work stream. Then if the student comes in, we actually then review them for the Promise program, which I'll talk about on a later slide. All right, so what is changing? Ideally, a whole lot less work will be needed between the student and the aid office, because ideally, as long as there's no, major changes, and this is the status you came in with, and students didn't win the lottery or have some major change in life that has made it more stable, they're going to be able to roll over this status, and I won't have to do this ping-ponging. Also, I won't have a rejected ICER, so I can offer aid faster with this provisional SAI. So I think that's huge. The provisional SAI is going to be a game changer, especially for incoming students, because we all know we already don't have a lot of time between when students file their FAFSA, getting their aid, and having them make a decision. And now that this, 24-25 year, the FAFSA is coming out in December, we'll have an even shorter window. So by having that provisional SAI, we will be able to send out estimated aid while we're working out, where you fall and what we need to update to confirm your status and have it be, renewable from that point on. We are also going to accept decisions from other institutions. So if we have a transfer student who already went through this process and had a determination made at the other institution, the guidance that we have now says that we can accept that as part of our professional judgment policy and procedures at the current institution. These are very sensitive conversations. I've been having them for 10 years. I know how hard it is for students to disclose the first time. I don't really want to make them go through that again if they've already sat down with a professional and that professional has confirmed this situation. Because if anything, I feel like our field, and I mean this in the nicest way possible, and since I work in it, I feel like it's fair to say, has a harder time saying yes than pivoting to documentation. So if someone has already confirmed yes, then I am going to work with that and move forward. And then again, awarding aid with the provisional SAI, and then having those 60 days to clean up the status and confirm that the aid that we awarded on that provisional SAI is the amount that they're going to receive. So my team is asking a lot of the same questions that you guys are asking, which is, well, then what is the difference? Like when I'm talking to these students, how do I know to start an unusual circumstance appeal? We actually use campus logic and collect the supporting documentation. And when do I just go to the FAFSA, hit homeless, and send it out for independent? So I wanted to give you guys just some examples of conversations we've had in the past that have led to one or the other. So I think one of the easier ones is, I've lived with a family member all my life that's not my parents. For whatever reason, that family member or person never took legal steps to have guardianship, and there's no court documentation I can provide. But I have a stable home. I've been there forever. I'm not saying I'm homeless. I'm not asking for anything. And this person I live with will, gladly write you a letter that they've been caring for me for so long. That we, completed dependency override for. I think what gets trickier is when they say, well, I am staying with this family member now, and they said I could stay for a couple months because this extreme circumstance or breakdown in relationship with my parents has happened. But after those couple months, I don't really know where I'm going to go. So I'm hoping to just get to campus, or can you help me get to campus earlier? And then you bring up the idea of breaks. What are you going to do when the dorms shut down over break? And they go, oh, well, I don't know. I do have another friend that maybe I could stay on the couch with. Like, by having these conversations, they're pretty much laying out some of the McKinney-Vento language of being, at risk of homelessness or not having an adequate fixed nighttime residence. So, what I'm hearing is you're doubled up, you're couch surfing, you do not have a stable residence that you can keep turning back to as this structure and stability in your life. So at that point, we would make a homeless youth determination. And then this last one, no relationship with parents, working and is trying to get an apartment, but unfortunately is 19, can't get a lease approved, has no co-signer. I think this one gets a little pushback on because people think, oh, well, the student is making money and they're not what's now a 0 EFC and soon to be negative 1500 SAI. That just sounds like an adult that's starting earlier, but the reality is that conversation still is, have nowhere to go. Like, yes, I'm making money, but that money isn't enough for either the cost of living in my region or not enough for someone to approve me to have housing. And therefore, I am still staying with other people. I am still, relying on campus to keep me year round. So that would fall under that at risk of homelessness, and I would make a homeless determination. And if Aaron and Kerri disagree with any of these, I'm clearly open to that, but this is what we're, doing right now in our reviews. All right, so then, in the beginning, when I was working with these students, it was just about getting them aid, right? Because that's my job. I was a financial aid counselor. But then more and more, as you work with these students, you realize they have some pretty significant needs and barriers. The biggest one was actually break housing. We would get all their paperwork done, the money on the account, them into school, and then only 4 months later say, okay, now pack up all your belongings and go find somewhere to stay for 5 weeks, because we're shutting down the dorms and we're not opening back up until the end of January. And they would be completely traumatized. We had a couple students that just never came back because they had to go far enough that they couldn't find a way to get back. And it was creating a barrier to retention of these students. So while working with our foundation and with the advisory board of both campus and off-campus constituents, we created the Promise program, which is a campus support program to try to fill in the gaps after financial aid. So one is the university does offer priority housing to Promise program students, including during the pandemic, where we make sure that they have housing year round. They do have to pay the normal amount for fall and spring and use their aid towards that, but then we help to cover those extra periods of time that they really weren't expecting or not really thinking of, which would be winter, summer, spring break, those times where dorms usually shut down. We do actually work very closely with the foundation to raise money to add additional funding to these students' account, whether that is gapping them with scholarships for their actual direct costs, or sometimes helping them with those other expenses that come up. A good amount of our students didn't have health insurance, and if something comes up medically, like they need glasses or they break a tooth, they get a flat tire on their way to their internship, there's no parent to call, there's no other adult to call. They're calling us and saying, as you know, by my situation, I'm really in a tough spot because this happened, life happened, and I need additional funds. So, luckily the foundation wrote that fund in a way that just says to support Promise students. So we really use it in many different ways. We also make sure that they have priority placement for work study, easy because we're financial aid, but our tutoring center also agreed to give them priority access to tutoring, and our graduate students that act as student success coaches, which just kind of gives them another ear on the ground to help with time management and making connections and resources on campus, because campus really truly becomes their home. It's their everything. And then for some of our students who don't choose to take summer classes, most of them do, because they like the idea of, well, if I'm already here, I might as well either catch up or get ahead. So that's some of what we use Promise program scholarships for. We do run a summer seminar series to try to close the gap on that and justify them as an active student, even if they're not in classes, and getting break housing. And then we do throw events for our students. We try to, provide them with holidays and, those types of things that you get at home, those feelings of celebration. We get asked a lot, well, can't they just come to my home? No, our students tell us time and time again, that's highly uncomfortable to just be crashing on someone else's holiday. So we try to do those types of things on campus. We have Halloween parties and Thanksgiving run by our Aramark, our dining hall. And then our biggest one is probably around the Christmas Hanukkah time. And then we do have a single point of contact. It used to be me, but luckily our university has recognized that this is a very demanding part of a job description. So we actually have a new staff member who is serving in that capacity, and I am still providing additional support, but that just gives the students somewhere to go for everything they can think of, pretty much like having a guidance counselor back, because it's really hard for them to re-explain their situation to an academic advisor, even honestly to admissions in the beginning, to the counseling center. Like, it's just very hard for them to repeat their circumstances over and over again. And sometimes they don't even want to say it the first time. So it is really important for us to, Jillian, if you want to go to the next slide, make sure the campus is aware that this program exists, that these students exist, that it's not what you're picturing, because sometimes I've had my Promise students tell me, oh, my professor today talked about the Promise program, like it couldn't possibly be me while I'm sitting in the room, so I don't know what they're picturing. So I just think it's important for everyone on campus to be aware, especially because a lot of the students that I meet and support are through referrals. So the counseling center, the care team, admissions, housing. I constantly get emails of, Tori, this student said this, what do you think? And my response is always, you need to send the student to me so I can talk to the student more, because the whole point of a single point of contact is not to make them repeat these stories multiple times or, try to get it right so they can get what they're actually after. And then the other thing you need to keep in mind, which I'm really glad Erin touched on, is we are not private investigators. We are financial aid administrators. So we do not need to get our binoculars and get in the car and try to figure out why this breakdown in the parent relationship happened, why we're choosing to couch surf or begging to stay on campus. I know that it's very hard because we've been, conditioned to say the more paper, the better, because you're going to be audited. But as Erin just explained, all we have to document is, how and why. We had a phone call, we have an email, we have documentation from one of those entities, and we made the determination. The end. And I can actually say, and I'm sure my supervisor doesn't want me to say, that we've gone through a program review, and at no point did the program reviewer say, Tori, why are you making all these homeless youth determinations? So I do think it is something where we need to stop being so scared of how little proof we're collecting and just focus on, this is the right thing to do. And this is what the department wants us to do in order to support the student. All right, next slide. We're back to Jillian.
All right. Thank you so much to our presenters. This was so much information. We have plenty of time for questions, which I am seeing all of them coming in. I'm going to go ahead and add the pin back for Erin and Kerri. Just a first question, can we just state again that schools that are doing a homeless determination, it is not professional judgment? Can we have another confirmation? Anyone can take the.
It is not professional judgment. It's its own special thing. And here's the reason why they separated out of professional judgment and FAFSA Simplification. FAFSA Simplification is, professional judgment is like case-by-case basis, extreme. The expectation is it shouldn't really apply to a population of students. It's a little bit different for unaccompanied homeless youth, right? Because you want to be able to serve any student that you identify as an unaccompanied homeless youth. So why the situation may be rare, because I saw one person in the chat that said that she appreciates because she remembers going through this herself in '98, and while she's sad to see that some people are still doing it, she's happy to see a program like at Tori's University. It can apply to a group of students like at Tori University. So it's not a PJ because it's not a case-by-case basis, but it is a unusual circumstance in sense. So that's why at the beginning I was saying that if you have a school who mistakenly still calls it a professional judgment, I don't expect for us at the Department of Education to get hung up on that, or like Tori's saying, ping somebody on a program review because they're using the wrong term. But in terms of classifications, unaccompanied homeless youth determination is a classification in itself and is not a professional judgment.
Amazing, thank you. We have a few questions about timing. So will a determination time of having been homeless the previous year change? Can a student certify as unaccompanied homeless youth the same year that they become homeless? So can we talk through kind of the dates for being homeless for the FAFSA?
They can.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can. They just might want to go, they either can go to the FAFSA and do a correction, or they can just go straight to the institution, request a homeless youth determination. Because our policy guidelines is the school must have a policy where they review requests for homeless youth determinations and they can't say no. So if a student wants to go to the school and request a homeless youth determination, even after doing the FAFSA, because the homelessness becomes recent, they can still do that. And the institution can just set the unaccompanied homeless youth determination flag on their side, submit that correction over to the Department of Education through what they have, a copy of the student's FAFSA is, to them, it's called an ISAR. And they can set a flag on the ISAR that say they make a homeless youth determination and send that over to us, and they'll be able to process the student as independent from there.
Amazing. Kind of going off of that, there was a slide that said institutions must publicly disclose ability for applicants to request an unaccompanied homeless youth determination. Can you better explain where the department expects the school to disclose this? Is there a specific website, a page?
No, we don't drill down that much in detail, and Lord knows you don't want us to. So as long as you publicly disclose it, however you choose to do that as of right now is fine.
All right. Another question that we get frequently is, would a student be considered independent if they are also experiencing homelessness with their family?
No, but they're not independent because they're experiencing homelessness with their family. However, one can make the assumption that because of the homelessness, that the income might be so low that they'll get the maximum eligibility of Title IV aid. So they're really, I mean, they'll still get the benefit of, because the whole point of the homeless youth, the unaccompanied homeless youth determination and not being with the parent is so they can proceed in the FAFSA as an independent student and not be required to have parent information. But in Tori's slide, when she was going through the scenarios about trying to differentiate between a dependency override and a homeless youth determination, I believe her third example was a student who is working, but they're just not making enough money to afford living in the region that they're in, which is something that we have heard of also. So in that situation, a student can be independent for FAFSA purposes to move forward through their post-secondary institution experience and on their FAFSA, but that student is still going to have to enter, if they file taxes, their income information is still going to go into that FAFSA. And so, and then you go into the requirements of the student aid index calculation and the Pell Grant eligibility calculation. So you're not going to get maximum Pell Grant because you are an unaccompanied homeless youth. You're just going to be able to provide the FAFSA without parental information because you've been identified as an unaccompanied homeless youth.
And I can confirm we've actually seen exactly that, where an accompanied homeless youth, somebody with their family, unfortunately struggling without housing and is doubled up, actually has a 0 EFC, but some of my Promise program students don't because they're working and they have enough income to, you know, not qualify for auto 0 EFC. So it's interesting because, you know, you think that's the end goal that they're after is that max Pell, but most of the students I talk to don't even consider that. They don't know Title IV formulas. They don't know, you know, really even understand the EFC. They're just trying to finish this damn form and get to school. And that's really all it comes down to.
Amazing, thank you. As another question we have, as a dependency question prior to FAFSA simplification, schools were not required to collect documentation. So for schools who chose not to collect documentation, do we just allow the student to continue as homeless, or are we required to collect documentation and then allow them to continue in future years?
So I spoke a little bit about that. Yeah, so in the Dear Colleague Letter Gen 1516, we were pretty clear about the schools are not required to verify any of the 3 homeless youth questions on the FAFSA. In the new Dear Colleague Letter we released, we do say that the students will have to provide the documentation. We intend to clarify that so that schools are aware that it kind of mirrors the guidance, the previous guidance in Dear Colleague Letter Gen 1516. Schools will not be required to verify the answers or collect documentation. I mean, now if a school has conflicting information or they're aware of something, then they would need to resolve that, just like they would need to resolve conflicting information for anything on the FAFSA that they have, other information about the student. But if a student answers yes on the FAFSA, even after the FAFSA Simplification Act changes take effect, the school would not be required to collect documentation, but that does not mean that the school can't do it. And like I said, as I said when I was presenting, we are aware that many schools do, just as an internal policy, collect documentation for all dependency questions, not just the homeless youth questions. So that would be within their authority to do so. So I know that there might be some, a person that goes to one school and says, well, I didn't have to provide documentation, but it could vary from school to school, from financial aid office to financial aid office.
Great, thank you for that clarification. We have another question. Will this new policy help stop financial aid rejections based on the financial aid administrator asking, do you still talk to your parents? This has happened several times, even though this person is a McKinney-Vento school district liaison and has provided proper documentation.
I can speak to this one too. So I didn't mention it when I was presenting, but if a student provides actual documentation, let's say the financial aid office is conducting the homeless youth determination, or they're just verifying the student's answer to the question. If the student provides documentation from the legally authorized entity, the financial aid office should accept that. That's it. And I remember in previous presentations I did, there was a question I got the letter from the McKinney-Vento liaison to the director of the homeless shelter, and I just don't agree with it. You have to accept that as a financial aid office, because that's the requirement in the law. Now, if you disagree with it, there may be mechanisms in which you can contact the supervisory agency, or and say, hey, I don't think that this individual is making correct homeless youth determinations. If you think that there's fraud, waste, and abuse going on, you can file a complaint with the Office of Inspector General at the U.S. Department of Education. But in general, if you get a letter from one of the legally authorized, director of a TRIO program or designee, then you should accept that documentation. And that is all you would need to document that. Or, even if it's a phone, like Tori said, if it's a phone call, it doesn't have to be necessarily the physical documentation, but you should accept that and not proceed any further. And, unless you want to file that complaint with a higher entity. But still, in the meantime, you still have to accept that determination. You can't, a financial aid administrator should not be in the position to override a legally authorized entity's determination that the student's homeless. And I don't think, again, I don't want to put too much, financial administrators were great. And we know but the overwhelming majority of financial administrators are aware of all this and they do a great job. So I don't say any of these things saying that this is something that financial administrators generally do.
And we have a really awesome template for a unaccompanied homeless youth determination that's part of our resources slide, which I'll get to in a little bit. So if you are an authorized entity, you can use this form, fill it out, send it, and you should be good to go. We have a few more questions here. I'm loving all these questions. We have someone who works in financial aid, and she says that I think what scares financial aids offices is making sure that once that audit comes around, they're protected for the decisions we make and have collected the appropriate documentation. Because if auditors have a finding, that means a rather large fine and potential losing of Title IV funding for a college. So our audit findings rather high in this area. Tori, I don't know if you can speak to that.
Well, I'm hoping that Kerri and Aaron will back me up, but this is a unique opportunity to stop stressing about documentation because you are being named an authority. You're being given a pretty long Dear Colleague letter to help you define exactly what you're looking for. And as long as you can say yes, 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 and hit the homeless box on the FAFSA and put in the file, I did this. And whether you have a email from the student, you documented and took notes from the conversation you had with the student, you have the district liaison, TRIO, GERA, PUD, RHYA, with that, you should be good. You shouldn't need, I saw in one of the Q&As 3 supporting letters or recommendations of homelessness. I don't even know what a recommendation of homelessness is to back that up. So yeah, I feel like this is one of the times where we should appreciate that less is more.
I would agree.
All right. If a student becomes homeless after their first FAFSA was filled, how do they change their status? Would the student change their FAFSA, or would it be up to the financial aid administrator to change?
We actually just had this recently where circumstances significantly changed from the time that the FAFSA was filed. So we actually did a homeless youth determination on the first FAFSA and the next FAFSA simultaneously. So we updated the status to independent for the current year. Wasn't really necessary because we only had a couple months left, but the student wasn't sure if they were taking summer classes or not. And we are a trailer school for summer, so it was something we just wanted to be prepared for. And then, obviously simultaneously taking care of the next FAFSA was nice to do in one sitting based on the time of year. But going back and having the student update the FAFSA is very tricky because the student currently right now with the way the FAFSA is formatted would have to answer yes to one of those sources of determination. And that typically doesn't happen if your status is changing mid-year.
All right. And is a 60 days determination from the date of receiving the FAFSA?
No, the 60-day determination is from when the student requested the homeless youth determination. So like Tori is outlining, they may not do that simultaneously at the same time. We have gotten the question though, in policy for 24-25, what if the student makes a determination later, like Tori just outlined? And whether or not a school can set a deadline for requesting homeless youth determinations. And so we are hoping to respond to questions like that. If not in another Dear Colleague letter, then maybe at the Federal Student Aid Conference or some other venue in order to get answers to those questions laid out.
So Kerri, I'm actually going to interject and use my presenter power to ask a follow-up question. I noticed that when you were presenting, you were talking about the provisional SAI that we have to make decisions within 60 days of the period of enrollment. So is that 60-day provisional window based on when the FAFSA was submitted or when they actually start classes?
For the provisional SAI?
Yeah, for the provisional SAI in 24-25. Actually not that far out anymore.
So there's the provisional independent status that gives them the provisional SAI. Oh yeah. It is, what was your question? 60 days from when they submit the FAFSA?
60 days from when they submit the FAFSA or 60 days from when they start enrollment?
Oh, that's a good question. That is a good question. Let me get back to you because the only reason I'm hesitating to say 60 days when they submit the FAFSA is because students can, let's say in a perfect world, the FAFSA goes back to October 1, 2025, or 2024 for the 25-26 award year. If we go back to October 1, 2024, there's a reasonable expectation that financial aid offices are not reviewing FAFSAs the day that they come in. So I don't imagine that we mean 60 days from the day you receive the FAFSA, because that could be October the 3rd, like literally it could be. But I don't think that we have said clearly what that is. And so since, as we said when this webinar first started, that the information is not for attribution, is I can't as an authority say the answer to that question because we haven't published an answer to that question, which is why I'm saying I'm going to get back to you, if that makes
That's
sense.
okay. I honestly didn't think of it until today. So every FAFSA simplification presentation brings something new.
It does.
Amazing. Love, we're getting live answers and questions right here at the spot. Perfect. I just want to make some clarifications in the chat. We put 2 forms in the chat right now. So one of which is the template for financial aid administrators. So as we've said, financial aid administrators have the responsibility to make a determination if an unaccompanied homeless youth cannot provide one from any of the authorized entities. And so we have a form specifically for financial aid administrators. And then we have another form for all those other authorized entities that can just mark the box saying, this is my role. Yes, I can confirm that the student is an unaccompanied homeless youth. So those are our 2 forms. And we actually have a really great video that we're going to put in the chat as well that shows how to role play a financial aid administrator, kind of walking through that form, that template, because that's a lot of feedback that we've heard from financial aid administrators. They don't feel confident. They're not necessarily sure how to ask those questions. So we just put that clip in the chat. Another question we have here is that we have a lot of local universities requesting that in order for them to approve their homeless youth determination, they need 3 letters of recommendation from folks who can verify their homelessness. So is this an allowable process? They mostly see this in their 2nd year.
So they want 3?
I think this is confusion about it being professional judgment. I think, you guys clarifying that it's not professional judgment will help to clarify those policies and practices, because I really truly believe that unfortunately there was administrators that still felt a little confused and groggy on this area, because we had a Dear Colleague letter, what was that, back in 15, 16? So this is more of like a codification and improvement. So I think that, this will help financial aid administrators understand that separate button to click, separate process to perform, because 3 letters of recommendation sounds like a professional judgment, sounds like a dependency override process.
I think with, all financial aid offices are going to be different. And I would hesitate to say that a school could not do something. What I can say is that we are providing the flexibility. You'll see in the Dear Colleague letter, it could be phone, it could be a documented phone call. So the schools are going to have to establish their policies on how they do these homeless youth determinations. And while, one individual may not be happy with a school's policy on how they conduct their homeless youth, determine how a financial aid office conducts their homeless youth determination, the department would most likely be checking to see if the school was applying their policy as opposed to, what their policy is, as long as the policy doesn't run afoul of the law. So while that's 3 letters of recommendation or 3 documents is not a requirement, Kira, I think we may want to take that back, but I don't see where that's also a prohibition for financial officers.
Yeah, we should take this one back, because this is one of those things that we could actually argue internally in terms of policy of how that can go about, because we also have to balance the intent of the law when Congress was writing it, and even drill down specifically to the language within the law, how it uses the word document singular and not plural. So we'll see. We'll take that one back with us also to provide some feedback.
All right, we'll have just a few more questions before we wrap up with some different resources, but where is the wording for the requirement for schools to disclose students' right to request homeless youth determination on school's website?
They want the legislative quote?
I thought it was in the Dear Colleague letter.
Yeah, so I think the Dear Colleague letter would be appropriate to send.
Okay.
All right. Will there be a frequently asked document for this new guidance for homeless youth? Yes, that is something that we did a webinar in December that highlighted some of these changes. We will pull from that document and add some of these questions and send that out to you in a few weeks. There's a ton of questions here, so we want to make sure that we'll get that all to you. And yes, there will be a recording of this sent to you in a few days, as well as the PowerPoint and some of the accompanying resources as well. So I'm going to go ahead and flip us over to some resource round out here and some key takeaways. First, just again, want to say thank you so much to our presenters. Y'all shared so much information. There's clearly a need to ask questions and to talk about it. So thank you for your time and your expertise. Just some 5 key takeaways from this webinar is that number 1, the 23-24 FAFSA questions look the same from previous years, but the provisions are in effect. Number 2, huge win that we are so excited about, that homeless and foster care youth status does not need to be redetermined. Number 3, more programs and officials can provide determinations. 4, again, this was already part of the guidance, but now it is in the law. But for students who cannot get those determinations from the authorized entities, financial aid administrators must make homeless and foster youth determinations and follow the processes outlined in the law. It is not a matter of professional judgment. I think if you're taking one thing from this webinar, that is it. Unaccompanied homeless youth and professional judgment are not the same. And that the last one, financial aid administrators should provide additional training, such as what Tori is providing on her campus on the specific pieces of homeless and foster youth. You can even share this recording with them. You'll get it in a few days. But if you're like, I don't know if I have the time for a full 90-minute webinar, totally understand. We created this 8-minute video that is here on YouTube. We'll put the link in the chat as well. This is a conversation that we had with a financial aid administrator at Johnson County Community College in Kansas. She walks through these new provisions, what it means for unaccompanied homeless youth, the different resources. We just snipped it in 8 minutes instead of a 90-minute webinar. So it's an awesome, awesome resource. We have other links here, which you'll get a copy of this PowerPoint, including both of the Dear Colleague letters that came out, both in November of 2022 and of April this year, just a few weeks ago. The website or the YouTube link that I just talked about, as well as our FAFSA page and our higher ed page. Here are ways for you to stay connected with us. If this is your first time joining a Schoolhouse Connection website or hearing about us, please follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter. We have a QR code here for you to just take a quick picture and subscribe so you can get all this information straight to your mailbox. And then I know folks have been asking about contact information. So I will put this slide here for you to get everyone's email addresses and so you can reach out to folks. But again, I just want to say thank you so, so much to all of our presenters. I know this was a lot of information to digest and just want to say thank you again. And we are here if you have any other questions. You'll get a copy of this recording, the PowerPoint, the resources, and you'll get a frequently asked question document in a few weeks. So thank you all again. We'll see you soon.